Just give me a moment here to get that started. We've got our other recording going. Okay, so thanks for your patience in webinars. We've taken a couple weeks off here, and I promise I have more for you coming up in a couple weeks' time. There'll be no webinar next Friday on that's going to be April the 4th, I believe. And so we'll come back on April 11th. I have a couple things in mind. I just haven't booked them yet. Good Friday, April 18th, we won't have a webinar, but we'll have one again on April 25th. And by then, I hope that Mosaics Grade 5 will be out and I can play through that at the end of April for you. We're anticipating that that book's probably ready in a couple of weeks' time. And then beyond that, we're already working on grade 6, just those of you who are waiting for that series to come out bit by bit through the year. We're very excited about grades 5 and 6, and I would say grade 6 should be ready by June. And so we'll hopefully have that out to you. Grade 7 we'll work on over the summer, and grade 8 I'm thinking probably more like the fall before we've got that out and our series will be complete. So Dr. Erin Parkes from Lotus Center in Ottawa joins us again today. This is part 4 in a series that she's given for us. You can look back at the CCTV YouTube channel and you'll find her past presentations there. In September, we started with just an overview of students working with students with exceptionalities. And then we went on to her second webinar in the fall, which included looking at students or teaching students with autism. And then the third one was working with students with ADHD or ADD diagnoses. And today we're looking at, or she's going to talk to us about working with students with learning disabilities in general. She also has another one planned that maybe we'll get to in the fall, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Erin, thanks again for joining us. I'm sure all of you know who she is now, and you'll enjoy this wonderful presentation. I'll turn it over to you, Erin. Let me know. I gotta let you share your screen though. So just give me a second here. And give you that permission. And there you go. You should take it away. Anyone, put your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A box as we go, and Erin will stop and we'll answer those at the end.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Derek. And like I said to everybody, I'm really happy to be here. Happy to have had the opportunity to give this series of presentations. And so now with this fourth one, we've really covered a lot of the sort of most common diagnoses. So today we're going to talk about adaptations for students with learning disabilities. So first of all, what is a learning disability? A learning disability is a neurodevelopmental disorder that significantly and persistently impacts ability to learn and use academic and other skills. And so today we're going to talk about the ways that it can impact the ability to learn, but also strengths that come with that and how it impacts music learning in particular. So it can affect the ability to perceive or process verbal or nonverbal information in an effective and accurate manner. And today we're going to talk about a number of different learning disabilities. Often we kind of really think about dyslexia, which is by far the most common learning disability. But there's also dysgraphia, which is challenges with written language. Dyscalculia, which is challenges with numbers and math. A nonverbal learning disability, which is disability with sort of visual spatial. So dyslexia is more a language learning disability. Nonverbal learning disability is not related to language necessarily, and auditory processing disorder. Today, we're not going to talk about dysgraphia because it's not as impactful on music learning. But we are going to talk about all the others. So we'll start with dyslexia, but I don't want to focus just on dyslexia because the others really can impact music learning as well. And there are some, relatively simple strategies that we can put in place. And I always really advocate for not hinging everything on a diagnosis. So sometimes we have a diagnosis, sometimes we don't. But if you have a student that is exhibiting some of the signs that we're going to talk about today of any of these learning disabilities, then you can apply these strategies. So some of the less common ones often are less common because there's less awareness of them. Even something like dyslexia, which is very common, teachers are not necessarily, and I'm talking about school teachers, are not necessarily trained in how to flag dyslexia, and certainly not the other learning disabilities because there's just less awareness of what they're all about. So just because we don't see them diagnosed as often does not mean they don't exist in much larger numbers. So that's why I'm really stressing with learning disabilities in particular, be prepared to just look at how your students are presenting. There's a lot more awareness of autism and ADHD, and so those things are getting flagged a lot more now than learning disabilities. And despite that, the impact of learning disabilities can be very widespread. So it can be associated with difficulties in one or more cognitive processes, such as phonological processing, so processing of phonemes or different sounds in speech and language, memory and attention, processing speed, motor processing, visual spatial processing, and executive functions. And you can see all of those things are related to music. It might be less obvious how phonological processing is related to music, but we will talk about it a little bit later and you'll see that it really is. So some other considerations about learning disabilities before we get into the specifics. Generally, somebody with a learning disability has average or above average intelligence. A learning disability has nothing to do with intelligence. It's just other issues that create challenges in learning. But part of the definition is that these difficulties cannot be attributed to an intellectual disability. So if somebody has an intellectual disability, they will not also be diagnosed with a learning disability. Also, the difficulties cannot be caused by vision, motor, or hearing impairments. So it really needs to be a cognitive issue here. So for example, for auditory processing disorder, yes, we're talking about difficulties processing auditory information, but it's nothing to do with hearing. It's the way that your brain is processing the sound. The impact can range from mild to severe, and this is where we sometimes get people not being flagged for it because they can sort of pass in school or, um, do okay, but they're struggling, and the teacher might not see that they're struggling. They might do okay on spelling tests and reading and everything, but they're working 10 times harder than other kids to make that happen. Usually those that are more on the severe end, those are the ones that we're seeing. There are even, at least in Ottawa, I know there are special classrooms for students with learning disabilities for those that have a more severe presentation. Approximately 80% of learning disabilities are language or reading related. So again, especially dyslexia. But this is important. Learning disabilities affect up to 20% of the population, and I've even seen up to 30%. But what's important to note is in children, it's like 5.6% or something that have a diagnosis of a learning disability. But once you get up into adulthood, you see the rates of diagnoses up to 20%. And it's a little bit higher for males. It was like 19.8% for males, and I think 17 or something for females. But it's because so many people can kind of get by, but once they get older and kind of gain more awareness, they realize, oh, I always really struggled with these things. And then they're getting diagnosed as adults. We're seeing that trend with a lot of things, a lot of adult diagnoses, adults seeking out a diagnosis because they learn about autism, they learn about ADHD, and then they're flagging it in themselves and going for a diagnosis. But we see that the most with learning disabilities. So now let's get into it. We're going to go through each of these diagnoses, dyslexia, dyscalculia, nonverbal learning disability, and auditory processing disorder, and how it impacts music learning. And then later we're going to get into the strategies that we can use. So a big part of dyslexia is poor phonemic awareness. So this is the ability to hear discrete sounds in words or to see them visually. So we think of dyslexia often as things like switching letters around or not perceiving the difference, for example, between a B and a D. And that is very common. Not everybody with dyslexia presents in that way, though. But there's way more to dyslexia than that. So I know when I started learning about this, I was not aware of how much there is to dyslexia. And this phonemic awareness piece is really sort of the piece that seems to be the most common. And so phonemic awareness, again, is like awareness of discrete syllables in words. So for example, being able to hear spaghetti and not just making it all kind of one sound. So hearing the syllables can be really difficult. We think of dyslexia as very much a reading disability, but it's a language disability. So it's also listening to words. So not being able to separate them necessarily when you're seeing them. So often we hear of things like not recognizing the spaces between words and that kind of thing, but also hearing the sounds. So difficulty distinguishing the order of sounds in a word. So it just becomes kind of jumbled. Difficulty processing subtle differences in sound. Confusion of right and left is really common. Difficulty with the articulation of longer words. Slow recall of known sounds or words. So sort of the retrieval of a word. Slow or poor handwriting. I know I said that's kind of what dysgraphia is about, but it happens in dyslexia as well. Spatial awareness difficulty, poor organization, and poor short-term memory. And those two pieces, the poor organization and poor short-term memory, really kind of go into a broader category of challenges in executive function. And if you've seen my previous presentations, we talk a lot about executive function a lot. So I'm not going to go into it a lot here, but it's things like organization, memory, task initiation, um, uh, self-monitoring. So listening to what you're doing and being able to assess if you're doing what you want to be doing, which is important in music learning, right? Did we play the way that we're trying to play? And if we didn't, how did we correct it? So you can see that with dyslexia, yes, it comes into play with writing, language writing, and language discernment in spoken language. But all of these things, difficulty processing subtle differences in sounds, and even the poor phonemic awareness, being able to process kind of spacing in sounds, that's rhythm. And there is a lot of research showing that dyslexia, yes, it can cause issues with note reading and reading notes on a staff, but also a lot of issues with rhythm processing. And some of the therapies that are used actually for learning disabilities and dyslexia are built around rhythmic processing and using rhythm to try to support some of these things because it's so intrinsic to language, right? We speak in rhythm, and that's how we can hear the differences in sounds. And part of not being able to perceive those differences in sounds is not hearing the rhythm of the language. So that's a huge part of difficulty with music learning for someone with dyslexia. I like this graphic here because it gives an idea of kind of what I've been saying. So I'm showing it as a graphic because some people learn better that way. So people think dyslexia is writing difficulties, reading difficulties, and spelling difficulties. But really, there are all of these other pieces here. And the diagnostic criteria is focused on the writing and the reading and the spelling. But we know that all these other pieces are here as well. So difficulty with numbers can be there. Short-term memory impairment is very common. Word recall, social anxiety, inconsistent phonological processing, weak executive function, stuttering, again related to language or rhythm of language, attention deficits. This can be related to the executive function piece as well, and having a literal interpretation of language. So now let's look at how dyslexia impacts music learning. So certainly sight reading. Dyslexia can make it difficult to decode musical symbols and patterns on a page, similar to how it impacts reading text. And we'll talk a lot about adaptations to help with music reading. Rhythm and pitch perception. So individuals with dyslexia may struggle to accurately perceive and process rhythm and pitch. We've just talked about that. Decoding information, so understanding musical vocabulary, symbols, and concepts, and transferring those to playing an instrument can be challenging. So all of those fancy words that we use in music, right? Italian words and all of that. If they're already struggling with learning in, their first language, this is just more stuff, more language that they can struggle with. And often they're syllables that are less familiar. Like in the English language, we have syllables that we use a lot. In different languages, they're different. So if somebody struggles with the phonological processing of language, that can be really challenging. And then things like the symbols that we use. The staff reading is largely due to visual spatial processing issues. But the symbols can also be challenging, remembering what symbol goes with what. And so here, like think of rhythmic symbols. So the difference between a quarter note and a half note, and what is a quarter rest? It's a weird looking symbol, and a half rest. So all of those things can be really challenging. And then taking those things, abstract concepts can also be difficult. So these are abstract, but even if they can learn the symbol and be like, that's a quarter note, that's a half note, that's a quarter rest, and they can identify them, then understanding what that means when they're actually playing their instrument can be really, really challenging. So that sort of abstract to concrete, concrete to abstract relationship can be difficult. Also memory instructions. So memory is actually a big issue for people with dyslexia. Remembering instructions, remembering rules in music theory, remembering musical pieces between their lessons. So that's something to keep in mind, that if you do something in the lesson, when they get home to practice, they might really forget what they've done in the lessons. So, and especially in high pressure situations. So when they get to an exam or a performance, this can kind of all fall apart. Organization and focus. So maintaining focus and staying organized while learning a piece can be a challenge. And horizontal and vertical tracking. So reading music requires both horizontal and vertical tracking, particularly playing the piano, where we have two stabs most of the time, which can be a difficulty for individuals with dyslexia. So reading one staff is difficult enough. But if you add in the vertical tracking, it's really a lot for someone with dyslexia to process. So we'll talk about some ways that we can adjust for this. So things like, just chording more with the left hand and working with sort of a lead sheet so they're not having to read, vertically can help a lot. Now dyscalculia. This is difficulty understanding numbers in real world applications, especially. So things like counting change, that kind of thing, or even things like phone numbers. So similar to what we see with dyslexia with the reading of language, it's the same kinds of things, but with numbers. So switching numbers, that kind of thing when you're looking at it written on a page. And then with hearing numbers, not so much an issue with like hearing or processing the numbers, but then understanding what they mean or what to do with them. So even we see in young children things like um, understanding the concept of five. Usually we teach this is the number five, and we teach them by counting things. They understand, oh, I counted 5 of those things. That kind of thing doesn't really stick for people with dyscalculia. And you can see how some of these things go under the radar because we can just think, this child's just having a hard time learning this, or they're just slow with reading, or, math is not their strong suit or whatever, when really there are real struggles underneath it. Difficulty with arithmetic, so just basic math operations, and challenges with abstract numerical concepts. So this you might be like, how does this relate to music learning? But similar to dyslexia, actually with all diagnoses, there's an iceberg. So there's always kind of what we see in the diagnostic criteria. And then there are all these other things that happen that go along with it. So dyscalculia is really identified by difficulties with math and numbers, but there's a lot of other things that are happening as well. So for someone with dyscalculia, here are the ways that it can impact music learning. So it can certainly impact sight reading and music notation. So students with dyscalculia can have visual spatial processing issues as well. It's not as pronounced as in dyslexic students, though, but they may struggle with understanding and interpreting musical notation. Those are symbols, again, that are a little bit difficult to pin down sometimes. So including time signatures, note values, and rhythmic patterns. These aren't numbers, but they're numerical concepts. And it's the next point. Difficulties with numerical concepts can lead to challenges in understanding and feeling the beat and the rhythm of music. So this is important. It's not just understanding the theory, though certainly that's a piece of it, but also feeling the beat, feeling the rhythm. Anything that has this sort of numerical quality to it, the beat and the rhythm are part of it. So music theory, dyscalculia can make it harder to learn and understand music theory concepts that involve numbers and fractions. That one's a little bit more obvious. And memorization. Dyscalculia can impact the ability to memorize music. So you see with both dyslexia and dyscalculia, the memory piece is actually really, really big. There are kind of obvious workarounds to that in music learning. We don't have to require memorization, right? But it's more the piece of like remembering from one lesson to the next, or remembering from lesson time to practice time. The short-term memory is more where the challenge is here than the long-term memory. And in terms of memorizing music, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but that's okay. In terms of the memorizing music piece, like for a performance or something, I don't find that to be generally as problematic because it's in their fingers by then. They're probably not really reading by or playing by reading anyway. They've learned different ways. You're teaching them by rote or different ways. So now it's in their fingers and they've got it. So they've got that long-term memory. It's the short-term memory that is more challenging. Nonverbal learning disability, there's less awareness of this one, but it actually is not uncommon. And sometimes it's sort of related to autism because there are similarities for sure, but it's not necessarily as the diagnostic criteria is different, and autism is usually a little bit more severe in its presentation. So again, autism for sure can go under the radar. We see a lot of people being diagnosed as adults. NVLD definitely can go under the radar because usually the presentation is not as severe. It can be viewed as sort of awkwardness or challenges learning in certain ways. So it involves visual spatial processing, so difficulty understanding and interpreting visual information, spatial relationships, maps, puzzles, that kind of thing. Motor skills, so often there are coordination problems and clumsiness. There's another totally unrelated disorder called developmental coordination disorder that often goes hand in hand with NVLD. Social skills, so difficulty understanding social cues, body language, facial expressions leading to social awkwardness. So if you know much about autism, you can see already there are some overlaps here, especially that social skills piece. And executive functioning, again, challenges with organization, planning, and problem solving. So NVLD and music, here's how it can impact music learning. Students may have difficulty reading notes on the staff. Communication and visual processing issues may cause issues following nonverbal cues during performance. So this is maybe less applicable to solo piano performance, but if you have duets or you have an ensemble, there's a lot of nonverbal communication happening in those settings. So the way that you look at each other, make eye contact, and have to feel your beat that way, that can be really challenging for somebody with NVLD. There can be a tendency to hyperfocus, and we see this in ADHD as well. That can aid or hinder music learning. So, it can be great if they're really focused on learning a piece, or if there's a passage that you want them to sort of drill and they get really focused on it and they're not getting frustrated, they're just really working on it. That's fantastic. We all want that as teachers. But it can also mean that they're really focused on that particular passage or a skill they're trying to build or something, and they won't move on to something else until they get it perfect. And so they can really not be able to get to everything that you want them to do or sort of see the whole picture because they're really focused on a piece. So that sort of whole to part integration that is also often a struggle for people with autism can be a struggle here. So seeing like this little part that they're really focusing on and then losing sight of the bigger picture. Students with NVLD often have superior memorization abilities. So this is something that you can really, really latch onto. And again, probably not by learning to read the music, but by rote or, kinesthetic learning or whatever way you're teaching them. And students with NVLD often learn very well by rote. Note that the one thing we haven't seen here that we saw in the previous two is difficulty with rhythm. So it's not really something that we see when teaching students with NVLD. Now, auditory processing disorder, and again, this is one that there's not a lot of awareness of it, but it's not uncommon and often also, and this is true for all of them, um, there are a lot of students that are sort of subclinical. So they are presenting with some of these challenges, but not quite enough to meet the diagnostic criteria. So students might have auditory processing challenges, but not quite have auditory processing disorder. So again, in auditory processing disorder, it has nothing to do with hearing. It's the way that your brain is processing sound. So it's things like difficulty understanding conversation delivered at normal speed. So that speed piece is a big thing. And one of the sort of tests that they sometimes do, you go in this like chamber for the testing, and there's all these different sounds that come at you. And part of it is sometimes a beep exercise. So it's like metronome ticks, sort of, or beeps getting closer and closer together. And it's like when it just becomes one sound and you can't distinguish anymore the separate beats. So that would happen sooner than it does for most people. And you can see how that would relate to music learning and rhythm. Unable to distinguish between spoken sounds. So again, that's um, sort of phonemic issue like with dyslexia, but it's being able to hear the difference between like a da syllable and a ta syllable, for example. Unable to filter out extraneous noises, so sound and noise issues. So, for example, if they're in a music room and there's lots going on, and they need to hear the teacher, or even things like if there's traffic going by outside, and you want them to listen to something you're saying or something that you're playing or whatever, the sounds can all have the same weight, whereas most of us sort of give more weight to what we know we're supposed to focus in on. So we're like, somebody is speaking to me, your brain automatically goes to focusing on that and filters out other things. For people with auditory processing disorder, that filtering doesn't necessarily happen. Difficulty following directions, especially multi-step, and weak auditory memory. So here are some ways that auditory processing disorder can impact music learning. So the first one, auditory discrimination, is quite obvious. APD can make it difficult to distinguish between different sounds, pitches, and tones. So there sometimes is, and again, this is not a hearing thing, because when we look at people with hearing impairments or people that are hard of hearing, we do often see too that there's a range of pitches that they can process. And if things get, higher, they might have trouble hearing it, or lower. Whereas most of us, of course, can hear all of the pitches on a piano. It's the same for APD, but it's not with hearing, it's what the brain is processing. So there might be difficulty hearing all of the higher pitches or processing them properly, but also things like, is something higher or lower, or is it going up or going down? Like those kinds of things can be really difficult for people with APD. Rhythm perception. So difficulty with rhythm and perception, including accurately reproducing and understanding rhythmic patterns, is a common challenge for individuals with APD. So it's important to remember here that there are no issues really in people with APD with reading rhythm or understanding rhythm. There could be, but it's not related to APD. It's it's the auditory information. So if you do, a clapback or any kind of ear training, often there's a component of ear training in what we're doing. They may really struggle with that. So with dyslexia, it's more the sight reading piece that they really struggle with. With APD, it's the ear training piece. And then there are all these other pieces that we're talking about as well. Sound processing. So APD can affect the ability to process and understand complex auditory information, which can make it challenging to learn and appreciate music. So if there are difficulties processing very basic sounds, like is this high or low, is it going up or down, separating out the sounds, you can imagine what it's like to try to process a whole piece of music. There's so much going on. There's harmonies, there's melodies, there's, all of this kind of different stuff happening. It's loud, it's quiet, it's fast, it's slow. So it can really affect the ability to, exactly what it says, to learn and appreciate music, because they're not taking it in the way that we hear it. So music appreciation, some individuals with APD may report a lack of music ability or appreciation because of these challenges. Okay, so that's what the different disabilities are and how it impacts music learning. So now let's talk about some strategies. And you can see even a very basic one in this picture of some color coding, music notes with color coding. So we will talk about that. But first, some sort of very general teaching tips, and then we'll break it down into like tips for pitch, tips for rhythm, tips for memory. Avoid requiring written work, of course, and adapt where it's required. So things like using a larger staff can help a lot for people with dyslexia or dyscalculia, or anybody has a visual spatial processing challenge, because that sort of black on white can be really difficult, and discerning if it's in a line or a space is tricky, but it's harder if everything is small. So just blowing things up and making it larger can help a lot. Be careful to support as needed, but not more or less than is needed. So in education, we talk a lot about the zone of proximal development, which means being on the edge of what the student can learn independently and just pushing a bit beyond and a bit beyond and a bit beyond. So you're right on the edge of what they can do. And once you kind of get them to the point that they can do that new skill independently, pushing a little bit more and giving them support. And once they've got that, pushing a little bit more. You for sure want to make sure you're not giving them less support than they need, but also so things like color coding notes can help a lot. We'll look at that in a minute. But don't color code if they don't need color coding, because then it becomes sort of, it can be a bit of a crutch, and you're taking away the opportunity for them to learn to read notes when they could learn it. But if you don't color code and they can't play, then obviously that can be a disaster. So it's really figuring out how you need to support your students. Work on one skill at a time and then build out gradually. So that sort of relates to the zone of proximal development. Always allow the student to demonstrate their learning in a way that allows them to feel accomplished. So if that means they're not reading, they're just playing because you've taught them by rote, or if it means that it's not even about instrumental performance, but they're showing you away from the piano what they've learned. Um, that's great. If they're showing you by improvising, however they want to show you is totally fine, remembering that they might have challenges with learning how to do it in the piece. Teach by rote or by finger number. I know sometimes we feel like teaching by finger number is like a bit of a cheat, but sometimes these things that feel like a bit of a cheat are actually the support that we need to give our students. There's some research that demonstrates that something like the Suzuki method or similar may be effective. So really learning, Suzuki is quite regimented. So there's a lot of repetition of discrete skills, working on sort of little bits over and over to really get good at the movement and all of that. The whole sound before symbol thing, so the oral learning first and then attaching a symbol to it, can make a lot more sense for people with learning disabilities, and the sort of continuous review. And I also think of this sometimes as spiral learning. So instead of learning step by step, so like, you learn something and then you go on to the next, task or idea, and then you go on to the next. And yes, you're continually incorporating these skills, new skills with the old skills. Like if you're learning, you've been just playing a 5-finger position and now you've learned to add a 6th or a 7th, you're stretching a little bit. Well, you don't stop playing in a 5-finger position sometimes, right? But it's going back and reviewing when those things were the extent of the learning. So go back and just do 5-finger position, because once they start stretching and doing different things, they might kind of lose that base. Whereas with a lot of students, we can kind of take for granted they have the base now, and we can keep adding on to that base. These students might lose that base. So you want to go back and just kind of keep solidifying it all the time. It's not to say you need to always go back and play old pieces, though that can be fun too, right? I like to do that when I'm learning, and just go back and play pieces that I'm really confident about. But it can also just be playing games where you're still working on those skills. Again, it's just about making sure that you don't take for granted that that base is still there. Now let's talk about some adaptation for rhythm. So doing very simple activities to just feel the beat, and not a lot more than that, maybe gradually adding strong beats and weak beats. But Del Crow's type games, even just like marching or walking or swaying with the beat, using kinesthetic learning, using balls or other props. So one of the things that I like to do is like pass balls on the metronome, either smaller balls or even like the big like yoga balls I like to use sometimes, or like bouncing and catching. You can use just a simple beat, and it's good to start with like just like a metronome, or you can use like a beatbox or something. It's just a little bit more interesting, but that's a lot more auditory information to process. So start with just a metronome. Remembering, actually, this is sort of my next point. I'm going into that one already. That's okay. Remembering to start slowly and work up from there because, with people with auditory processing disorder in particular, that, they can have difficulty processing the beat when it's closer together, when it's happening faster. So, start with the beat at 60 beats per minute and then try to go up to 69 and then try to go up to 76 and try to like go up in little bits and see again that sort of zone of proximal development idea. Where do they sort of hit their line? And then work up to that and then try to gradually push. We're doing this all the time, right? It's just being very conscious of using it in that context for this particular group of students. Start with oral or kinesthetic learning before introducing notation. Again, that sound before symbol piece. And using visual representations other than just simple black symbols. Um, just reading the black on white can be difficult, and especially when it's like you've got the staff that is like these 5 horizontal lines, and then you've got just these dots like placed wherever on the staff, and then you have vertical lines cutting between them for the stems. Like it's just a lot to take in. So using like color and size variants can be good because things like, okay, this one has a stem because it's a quarter note, or is it a half note? Is it black in the middle or is it white in the middle? Like, and also trying to process, well, where is it on the staff? So for the rhythmic values, um, there's a sort of method called figure notes, which can be really great to use with these students because it uses color, but it also has like the notes are to scale. So instead of it being these sort of abstract symbols, like why is it black in the middle and then white in the middle for half note? Who knows? But that's just the way it is. It's so abstract, but with figure notes, it's longer. So if it's one beat, 2 beats is twice as long, and 4 beats is 4 times as long, and it's very easy to see. So using something like that can be really helpful. It takes away the abstraction. And then at the same time, you can be learning the symbols and working on them and gradually weave them into the playing, because I'm not necessarily saying that these students shouldn't learn traditional notation, because we want them to be able to function in the music world in as many ways as they can. And that's what they're going to use probably if they learn music at school or they ever want to jam with other people or whatever. But that might be really difficult for them to start. So it can be great to start with these non-abstract, this notation that corresponds more with what's happening, and then sort of work on these other skills. So here's a representation too of some rhythm cards that I use a lot. They're not they're not arranged by bar or anything, obviously. It's just to show you kind of what we use. So you'll notice that the cards have color coding. So everything that's 1 beat is a green card, including the pair of eighth notes, that's 1 beat. And then 4 beats is red, and everything is color coded there. But they are also to scale. So just like I was saying for figure notes, the half note is twice as long as the quarter note, and it's the same for rests. So I also have cards for rests that are the same thing. It's really easy to make these. You just have to, print them out on different colors and make sure that you're accurate when you cut them out. But these kinds of things can help a lot. So I find having those steps, like using something like figure notes for the music learning, the instrumental performance piece of music learning, having something like this for when you're teaching the symbols, and then gradually removing those supports as the student is ready. And that can be a really long time. It can be years before you can remove these supports. And that's fine because they're making music all the way along. And they're making music more happily because they're not frustrated, because they're able to understand everything that's happening. Now, some adaptations for music reading. Always use a multimodal approach. So use manipulatives, use singing the note names. I use fixed do solfege a lot because it's easier to sing in solfege than it is to sing the letter names. And I just teach those as the notes because why not? It doesn't have to be the letter names. It can be in solfege. I use fixed do because it's easier than like do is middle C, right? And it just goes from there, do, re, mi, fa, sol. Um, and I find that teaching the notes, especially at the beginning where notes are pretty simple, by singing and then just transferring that to the instrument works really well. So if we're doing, for example, hot cross buns is like a really common early one, right? So I would just do it like in imitation. So I would sing mi, re, do, your turn. Hmm, hmm, hmm. Mi, re, do, your turn. Hmm, hmm, hmm. Do, do, re, re. Hmm, 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 hmm. Mi, re, do, your turn. Hmm, hmm, hmm. Like that. Notice that it stayed in rhythm, right? Because that's important, especially for students that are maybe struggling with rhythm. We want to like keep the beat going as much as we can. So they're just building an innate understanding of that. And then gradually I would make them longer. Mi, re, do, mi, re, do, your turn. And, just double the length of what I'm doing. And then eventually they've got it all and we're singing the whole thing. So now they've memorized what the notes are. And I've taught them the keyboard geography at the same time. And often I'll use things like I have this big keyboard piece that I put out, and I have pieces that are like the three black keys and then another piece that's the two. So they work on that as well. Like they have to put the three, then the two, then the three, then the two. They get the pattern. And then we do things like put colored gems on every do or C, and then put like, or if I'm doing all different colors, I use the colors of like boom whackers. So like C is red, D is orange, E is yellow. If you're familiar with boom whackers, I use the same. So we can put a red card on the do and so on. And they've just sung mi, re, do, mi, re, do. They now know from that keyboard geography game where mi, re, and do are. And they just go to the piano and they play it because they've got the pieces that they know. And we haven't done any note reading yet, but that's okay. We would work on the note reading sort of as remedial activities. So away from the instrumental performance, because there's like your brain is doing so much when it plays the piano or any musical instrument. Like, let's take out the pieces that are really challenging and just allow that musical performance piece to be relatively easy and then work on these parts that are more challenging away from the piano and then gradually weave them in. So using color is really important. I use color-coded notes all the time. Note that I didn't really say anything about color coding when I talked about rhythm other than with the cards, but when you're working with the staff, I don't because you can only color code so much. So I go with color coding the pitch. If you're color coding the pitch and also the rhythm, that's like a lot. So I just color code the pitch and I'll show you on the next slide what that looks like. You could also color the staff, like have line one be red or, however you want to do it. But having color is important because otherwise staff reading is just like a sea of black and white and it can be really hard to see it. So another piece there is you can use colored overlays, and I'll show you that on the next page as well. Because part of it can be visual stress, and the black on white is more difficult for our brain to process when we're experiencing visual stress. So softening that by using either printing it on a colored sheet or using a colored overlays that you can put in front of the sheet can help a lot. Isolate elements on the page. So just have a single line of staff cover the other line so they're not worried about that vertical reading. cover the expression marks at first. So even though, often we won't be expecting our student to pay attention to all of that right away, it's still on the page and it's something that they're visually processing, even if they're not doing it. So just cover those things up. You can use icons or alternative notations, something like figure notes. Mnemonic devices work really well, I find, with students. So, the things that we probably learned with when we were kids, like face for the spaces, right? Or every good boy deserves fudge, like whatever, more current ones you want to do. They work really well for students with learning disabilities. Um, to be honest, with my, neurotypical students, I often didn't use those because I wanted them to understand the relationships between the notes. So I would teach more sort of intervallically or, steps and skips and all of that. Um, but those concepts can be really difficult for students with learning disabilities, and the mnemonic devices seem to work really well. And also point for your student until the piece is learned. Like I said, for some of them, the rote learning is really good. They're really good at that. So just help them through it until they get that piece, and then they'll be golden. Write in the note names where they're needed. And again, be careful here that you're not giving more support than is needed. So if they don't need every note name written in, don't do it. Write it in where it's more difficult. I sometimes will write it the first time a pattern comes, but then if the pattern comes again, I don't write it anymore. But whatever works for your students. Don't require sight reading, and do remedial activities and make them fun. And by remedial activities, I mean away from the music performance. So flashcards, music reading games, that kind of thing. With all students, especially when you're working with students with exceptionalities, whatever is more difficult for them, you want to make the most fun. And both because they'll be more engaged in learning it, but just also to reduce their frustration and make them feel like music learning is fun. So if the note reading is a real challenge, don't focus on that when you're doing, like playing the piano. Play games. Let them build up an understanding of that, and then again, weave it in when you need to. So here's just a picture of the colored overlays. There are all kinds of colors for these. There's a whole like science to it. There's like Erlin is a system where you can get like colored glasses and they do all these tests to see which color works best. I mean, we're not going to do that, right? But you can have a bunch of different colors and just try them and just let the student tell you which is most comfortable for them. And then you can just put it in front of their page whenever you play it. I've also just taken a really basic Alfred's piece here and shown you how I color coded. It's not anything scary or intimidating. I use pencil crayons and I just do it that way. You don't have to get fancy, like print it out again or anything. This works 100% fine. Now, memory challenges. This is the last piece. Noting that on a lot of them, we talked about memory challenges, especially dyslexia and dyscalculia. They're mostly short-term memory or working memory. So short-term is kind of like remembering, for example, from your lesson to their first practice for getting there. Working memory is during what they're doing. So there's a key signature, remembering that key signature as you go through, that kind of thing. So again, less the long-term memory, like taking like having difficulty that they've learned a piece and then later they can't remember it. If it's in their fingers, they've probably got it. But it's things like can't remember what was just seen or heard, difficulty remembering key signatures, difficulty following multi-step instructions, and poor working memory. So some adaptations for memory, use all the senses. So let them move and feel it, let them sing it, let them see it with different icons, different things that are not just reading the staff. Like let them experience it in lots of different ways. But we talk about that a lot when we're memorizing pieces, right? Like listen to it and follow along. Like there's all different ways rather than just play it and play it and play it and play it. Though the repetitive playing can be very successful here because of the real strength with rote learning. But trying all these different things. But yes, repeat, repeat, repeat. Use the kinesthetic memory as much as possible. Write-in aids if the working memory is poor. So if they have a hard time, this, it's pretty straightforward. But again, sometimes it might feel like a cheat. But write in the accidentals if there's a key signature. Write in the pedaling all the way through, even if it's a pattern that's just repeating. Be purposeful about committing important elements to the short term and then the long-term memory. So things like if you're working on different dynamics or different articulation, for example, really working on them a lot in the lesson kinesthetically, because that's how they're going to learn it the best. Get it in their fingers, send them home with very specific notes, and just kind of be very consistent in playing it kinesthetically with the ways that you want them to learn it. And then that's how it will get ingrained in their long-term memory. Again, it's the short term that you have to really work on. It will probably be okay with the long term. But don't force memorization unless it's a real goal for some reason. And be prepared to review concepts over and over again. Again, that spiral learning, going back, making sure that they still have that base and that any new concepts that they've still got it, don't take it for granted that they're going to have all of that. Their long-term memory for things like kinesthetic learning is excellent, but these concepts can be more challenging. So just be prepared to do a lot of review, work that into your lesson plans and your curriculum. Okay, that's it for my presentation. My email is there. I'm always happy to answer any emails for questions or anything that may come up for you after the presentation. So I'm going to stop my share. There we go.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Erin. That's really informative, a great overview of learning disabilities in general and in detail. We'll just take a couple of questions here and then we'll stop the recording in the live stream on YouTube in case anyone here in the live room has any extra questions that they don't want on camera. And so if anyone has questions here that are with us live, go ahead and put them in the chat box or the Q&A. We've got one here from Kathy. Can you please elaborate on spiral learning?
Yeah, so spiral learning is think of it as like a spiral that's sort of like gradually moving up, but keeps sort of circling back over itself. So like you have a concept that you've learned and then you're going up and kind of learning a new concept. So let's say maybe like let's go back up to the very beginning, right? Where you maybe start with like quarter notes and then you move on to half notes. So you've done that, but you have to flip back down to learning quarter notes. And then, but you keep having to flip back, but maybe not to the beginning, right? Like you don't necessarily have to go all the way down, but kind of review the last concept and then move on and then review the last concept again and like keep going that way rather than we've got quarter notes, we've got half notes, we've got this. So it's always just folding in the last concept into learning the new one because usually they're related, right? Like you learn a concept and then you go up a little bit from there. Because they can have difficulty with these concepts, you want to really make sure that they have that concept as you're introducing the new one. Again, it's just not taking for granted that they've got it. So just working it into the way that you're teaching to always loop back to that last thing.
Right. I find it just never take anything for granted. You just never know where a student's coming from. I've recently had a couple of students come back that are challenged in different ways, and we've just had 2 weeks off. And in yesterday's lesson, it felt like a lot longer than that. And I was easily reminded it's so easy to get ahead of ourselves. And then you quickly undermine their confidence, which can send that spiral heading in any number of directions to the point where maybe they don't want to come next week. That's the kind of challenges I'm starting to see in my own studio. And so what I'm trying to summarize, I guess, your work today and a lot of your presentations, it's a lot of, change our expectations. You must work a lot more slowly. The pace is going to seem glacial, but if you set up this spiral thing where you're constantly reinforcing, consolidating, looking to see that they're confident or not, you have to learn to read that. And then all of a sudden you might just get this big burst where they're up a level from where you thought they might be all of a sudden and you're ready to proceed into a new spiral. Does that make sense?
Yes.
What I'm
Yeah,
describing
absolutely.
here? Okay. And so we've got a couple other questions popping up here. Do you have a strategy for balancing the therapeutic value of music for learning the things that challenge the student while not making it feel like you're hammering away at something that they are frustrated by?
Yeah, so I think the best way for me to do that is that idea of like doing remedial activities for the things that are the most challenging and making those games because it can feel like you're hammering away when it's like they're not getting the note names or whatever, and you're just, continue working on that. I think it's two things actually. So viewing those things as remedial activities that you're pulling away from the other music learning and allowing them to develop those skills discreetly, but also working on those skills in many different ways. So have like a rule out staff on the ground and you're doing activities there and moving around and doing things there to work on note reading, having some sort of game that you're playing, at the desk or whatever, doing flashcards, putting one note up like a card with one note and then improvising around that, but it's building that you know, between that note and the keyboard, working on that. So all these different ways that you're reinforcing the concept that it's not going to feel like hammering away because they won't even necessarily know that it's the same concept that they're working on. They're just playing all these different games.
And so maybe what the question, the person asking the question is wondering about, and I've wondered the same thing. If we use the same couple of tools from our toolbox, that's where a student might get frustrated because they don't feel like they're advancing. Where it sounds like you have this vast toolbox of things that you can draw upon. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I will say too, I never at all considered myself a creative teacher. I learned very much like in a conservatory manner.
Yeah.
It's been really a long time of building this toolbox, but also like reaching out and trying to find things. There's so much online now. Like there's tons. So if you encounter an issue with a student, there are lots of tools out there, really creative, fun tools. Just like take some time to find them.
And for our audience, I was recently at the MTNA conference. This is the Music Teachers National Association in the US. It was held in Minneapolis 2 weeks ago. And I was on the lookout for those things on the trade show floor. And I'm going to be bringing some of those people on so that we can see some of the unique things. A lot of them are digital and a lot of them are more analog things. And I've got a couple of books and other guests I have in mind to help us broaden that toolbox. I know myself, I was on the lookout for rote teaching pieces. And I found some stuff. It's not, it's sort of what I want, but to build on what I started with, let's say the Piano Safari wrote teaching pieces, which I found really great last year, I feel like I need to broaden that and have even more on hand all the time. One of the things I remember you mentioning previously at one of the previous sessions was you like the Alfred method, and even if I remember correctly, the prep version of the Alfred method because it moves so slow and you have so much repetition. And I used to use that a long time ago, and of course, long left it because those that could read, I want them in a certain direction. But I think I'm pretty much ready to go back to that for a few students that could really benefit from that constant repetition.
Yeah, and it's very slowly sequential,
Yeah.
right? And each new skill is taught as one new thing. And that's what I like about it. It might seem like not as modern now, like we've kind of moved beyond that a lot, but
Oh, yeah.
I find it works really well for these students.
Yeah, I'm glad I held on to my copies of that. Okay, more questions here. I often use images when teaching. For example, a rising scale passage is like cycling up a hill. Then there's a moment of suspension before descending to illustrate a moment of tension. Do students with learning disabilities struggle with this? Some of them give me blank stares when you try to describe that.
So it depends if they have a really clear um association with this. Like, can they really feel that experience? So if they can, then it can be a really good tool because they can relate to, they're like, oh, I know how that feels. And it puts it in their body, which can work really well for them. It's more if they like, okay, I've ridden my bike, but I go up a hill and then like, I don't know, I don't have that feeling, then they're not relating it to anything, then that becomes another abstract concept to them. And so you can try it, and if you get a blank stare, then you know it didn't hit, and that's okay. Nothing lost. But it can be more helpful to like draw something and let them see it. And relating it to a story or something is great, but it needs to be something that they can construct meaning from their own experience.
And it seems that it's the actual getting them to actually physically move sometimes. There's no substitute for that kinesthetics,
Mhm.
sensation right there on the spot. However, you can create that tension in their bodies for them, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Can a tendency to hyperfocus be misinterpreted as perfectionism?
Yeah, absolutely, because perfectionists do it too. Like
Mhm.
often we see students with perfectionistic tendencies really focus on getting something right, right? And they can't move on until they get it right. And they have to keep restarting until they get it. And they can't continue. And so it will often look much the same, but it's coming from a very different place. So for sure, it could be misinterpreted.
Yeah. Something else in the chat here is not a question, but Ruth is sharing spiral learning is like backstitching. You have students darken all the black keynotes when writing notes in intervals, chords, and scales, and you think this helps them to make the black notes or the black keys visually pop up on the staff. That's an interesting thought. Just seeing if we got another question here. Well, Wendy is sharing, or no, Ellen is sharing that Wendy Stevens of composercreate.com has written many pieces that we can learn by rote. Thanks for that. And I plan to share some of these resources later in another webinar too, the ones that I've come across lately. I think what we'll do in the interest of time, we'll stop the recording there and we'll just see if anyone has any questions otherwise. But those that are watching the replay after the fact, thanks for joining us on the YouTube stream here.